Welcome to the Pharmacy Inspection Podcast, where we discuss topics related to sterile and non-sterile compounding pharmacy in an effort to promote compliance and increase quality. Please welcome your hosts, Brian Prince and Seth DePasquale.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Pharmacy Inspection Podcast, a show dedicated to all things compounding, where we talk about pharmacy compounding compliance and improving the overall quality of our practice. Hope everyone had an awesome Thanksgiving last week. We took a little bit of a break for the holiday, but today on the show we have Cheri Kraemer, owner of Pharmacy Specialties Inc. in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. Cheri's pharmacy compounds both sterile and non-sterile formulations and was recently distinguished by PCAB for compliance with USP 800. We'll be talking a little bit about that honor and her experience with becoming compliant.
So, Cheri, tell us a little bit of your background, a little bit about yourself, your compounding pharmacy. Tell us who you are, Cheri, and what you do.
Okay, I am Cheri Kraemer from Sioux Falls, South Dakota. I actually graduated from South Dakota State University in 1985, so I'm kind of old. I've been compounding really for about 30 years. When I started working for a gentleman, I did all the compounding in a retail store, and we were in a big medical clinic with physicians, a lot of dermatologists. So that was the start of my compounding, which I always tell my staff now that everything's so much more regulated, because I got stories about how we used to do things and then how we do things now. So it's very interesting. I started the compounding pharmacy from scratch in 2001, and I used to have 2 retail stores and the compounding store. Now I just have 1 compounding pharmacy. In 2015, I merged my 2 pharmacies, Clinic Pharmacy and the Pharmacy Specialties, which they sat right next to each other in the same location, basically. So in December of last year was when I sold to a local chain the Clinic Pharmacy. So that's when I, again, was compounding only.
Great. So in weeks past, we've been hitting hard on USP 800 because that's been that hot topic. And what brought this conversation to light with you is that we know that you were the first to receive the ACHC's hazardous,
distinguished handling of hazardous drugs, I think is what they summed it up as.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And John, I was at the ACHC last week speaking to them at one of their 800 workshops. We're going to get John Pritchett on very soon so he can give us a little more background about that. But tell us about your path going and becoming compliant with USP 800.
Well, I've been thinking about hazardous chemicals for a very long time. I had a hazardous room, which we mostly just made capsules in and manipulated hormones. And I've had this hazardous room since 2010. Well, I mostly was just looking for a way to always protect my staff from, chemicals that they dealt with on a daily basis. And at that time, I didn't even know that 800 was in the works. So when 800 came out, I grasped that. I actually was the first one to give it to our Board of Pharmacy Inspector in South Dakota. And I said, this is coming down the pike. You guys need to, be aware of this. And at that time, I didn't really have enough time to focus on that, specifically. So I really just focused on 800 in the last, since I built out, and I started a remodel in December of 2016 after I sold the retail pharmacy, and that was specifically for compliance of 800. So when we decided to go wholeheartedly with compounding only, it just was the next thing. I just wanted to be ahead of the game because I think it's a good thing to be ready for. So
I'm always interested to hear what other people's actual experience was with in becoming compliant. And you're such a great example of this because you actually have gotten an award because of how well you pulled it off. So I'm interested to hear the process you went through.
I think I had it somewhat easy because I had already had that room that was designated. I think what most people struggle with is space Well, I kicked out the whole retail side, so I had lots of space. I basically moved the non-hazardous, non-sterile lab into where the retail pharmacy was, and then I had the rest of the area to work with. Um, I found that the only thing I stumbled on, we moved our clean room, our sterile suite, because I used to have the glass walls with the ledges. So I went to a hardtop ceiling, epoxy painted walls, concave floors, and so when I built out that suite, I mostly had a plan, but some of the air issues in there, we put the indicator lights above the door so you could tell when the room was ready to go into and use because the air quality was good, and so we kind of had the new hazardous part of the sterile suite, those two rooms. So it was the hazardous prep room and then the buffer room. You walk through the hazardous prep room into the buffer room, and those suites were always, the lights were red. So we had issues with that, but we've since fixed that. And we didn't really have to use them right then because 800 wasn't really, I could consider myself compliant because I had a BSC room and I had a non-hazardous sterile hood, but I didn't really have to use those rooms, so I was fortunate there. Because some people, when you plan to be shut down and you have to have everything perfect and go live this day, you don't have that luxury, but I had the luxury because I just moved equipment that I had. So I didn't really have any issues. I really had to take my then hazardous room and vent the hoods outside. And I took a portion, and I really expanded. My hazardous room was right next to my sterile suite then, so I expanded my hazardous room into my sterile suite that I had moved. So I already had HEPA filters in there, which we took those out because I had HEPA filters and the proper air exchanges and whatnot in my hazardous room to begin with. So I don't know. I think maybe my forethought from years ago helped me, but I really didn't have any big issues except some air exchanges, some air quality issues in the new sterile suite.
So, Cheri, would you say that your hazardous non-sterile as well as your hazardous sterile rooms, both of those rooms are 100% exhausted out of the building?
Hazardous sterile, yes, they are. They are. Yep, I have about 6 or 8 chimneys up there in my ceiling.
Wow.
And are the hoods contributing to all of the exhaust, or do you also utilize low air grills that are also exhausting out, or are the hoods doing all of the job?
No, we have. I think we have some support of other areas, and I don't know enough about that maybe to answer that question. But I did put all of the hoods in the non-sterile hazardous room on one duct because I felt if it comes back that we have to filter that again before it leaves the building. I want to just be able to put one filter on that.
Right. Yeah. That component of filtering the air before it leaves the
That
building.
they took away, yeah.
Yeah.
That was originally in
exactly.
the regulation, then they took it away, yeah.
Exactly. One of the things that they didn't anticipate, well, they anticipated that if not all, but most of the exhaust leaving the hazardous rooms, leaving the building would go through HEPA filtration because all hoods, whether it's a BSC A2 or a Class 1 powder hood, whatever you're using in that particular room, they are filtered through HEPA filters. So in theory, you're throwing out clean air out of the building. However, I think one of the things they did not anticipate is that when you use low air grills, which are low air exhausts, and you tie those into the exhaust also, they're not actually going through a HEPA filter. And just one of those things that I just happened to think about a couple of weeks ago is that what if? So
Right.
who knows exactly what the
all
part
my sterile suite, all of that is all of that is contained and continued. But yes, the other part of my building, I totally see what you're saying there. Yes.
So I'm curious, how did you come to understand that the ACHC was putting that hazardous distinction out there, and how did you make that connection with the ACHC to 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 become that? Were you a beta site, or
I was
do
a
you have?
beta site, and we actually our regular accreditation through PCAB was due this summer. Well, then in review of the regulations that had changed for that, I actually called in compounding consultants Brenda Jensen and Jim Hack, because they always do my walkthrough,
Mm-hmm.
my pre-PCAB survey.
Yep.
And then they say, okay, these are things that have changed since 3 years ago, your last survey, and then this is, what you need to do to get compliant for that. Like one thing I remember doing is we did pHs on our flavorings. So, and then we had entered the actual pH and the flavoring into our software, so that, if you think you're going to add enough flavor to change the pH, then you have that visible right on the formula. So, little things, because we were really pretty compliant. We try to keep up, but what I struggle with being a small independent owner is all the paperwork, So where I really fell down was to, I needed a compliance officer, basically, and I was kind of that, but the documentation wasn't there. So those were the areas that we worked on. So.
I think going forward, if we're going to become more regulated by potentially the FDA, that's a really big thing that they harp on is change management. And you probably will start to see more and more pharmacies getting a QA person, or some kind of compliance officer, because it'll become absolutely necessary.
Right. When we had our monthly meetings, I always took notes, and I always had good documentation, and everything listed that was discussed in any error. We had in there. We always had the a section, customer complaints or close calls or near miss, the things that you catch before, someone picks up the wrong med or whatever, So I always had any of that documented, but I didn't have a way to trend it. And that's what I've since improved that part of our SOPs, I think, greatly.
Yeah, so one of the questions that I get or have gotten early on in the USP 800 process is the question of this is, am I going to need to hire a separate compliance person? That designated person who's responsible for making sure that the training's in place, the new, hazardous SOPs are in place. And, that seems to be kind of a huge burden. And the answer to the question is really, it depends. It depends on, what percentage of your business is hazardous. Are you, 90% of your business hazardous? Do you have multiple locations? Is it something that you as the owner, and I'm sure, both Seth and Cheri, you can appreciate this, is how many hats do I have to wear on a daily basis between accounts payable, accounts receivable, marketing, who didn't show up for work today, patient consults, whatever has to be done that needs to be done. And so I did a little bit of research on one of the U.S. Census Bureau websites or one of the employment websites, and the compliance person is on average somewhere between like 32,000 and upwards of like 48,000. And so if you think about the amount of business that has to be generated just to pay for that person's existence, because you know as well as I do that a $32,000 a year salaried employee isn't really a $32,000 a year employee, because by the time you account for, employee payroll taxes and health insurances and all those other things, what is the price tag on that? And then what is the average gross margin of the compounded sale? And then somehow a formula pops out the backside going, well, we've now got to generate at least $75,000 in new business just to pay for that quote unquote compliance person. But then, the opportunity cost of taking one of those hats off of your head that you can't necessarily deal with because you're trying to run a business. So one of the comments I made to Seth the other day is I said, sounds like to me that you're spending too much time working in the business and not on the business. And a lot of entrepreneurs go through that. Certainly understandable, because, you're there to run a business. And so it is interesting to try and tackle that question of whether or not the business deserves or needs a compliance person.
Yeah, and I think everybody needs a compliance person, but yes, affording that person is definitely the issue. So, especially when you're adding hazardous gowning, gloving, all of those issues that add a great expense on a daily basis, to your store. You have to do X amount of prescriptions more just to account for being a USP 800 compliant pharmacy.
So are you using the fact that you are you've already taken on compliance, even though that, they pushed the compliance out for another 17 months, you're already there. You've gotten this distinction from the ACHC. Do you use that as a marketing tool when you're out talking to providers, or your marketing person's out talking to providers? Do you feel like that is a worthy sales tool to be able to use out there to tell your story?
I think that is a worthy sales tool. The only thing is, if you start talking too much about that, they don't have the understanding that it's just protecting your employees. They feel like then, oh, you're doing hazardous stuff, and what is the patient getting? You'll get that question, oh, hazardous? So the stuff is hazardous? What you make is hazardous? So then you have to be clear to explain, well, there's a hazardous handling, which is really just employee-based, and it doesn't, affect the public product. So I think that's always an interesting question, in that when you start talking hazardous, you have to be very clear to make it understood, properly where the hazardous detail is regarded. Because I don't feel like everybody understands. They hear the word hazardous and they always think of chemo right away. There's not really an understanding that because it's hazardous and an employee deals with, estrogen every day, that's a hazard. So that's kind of what I've learned from talking to people about this.
So, Cheri, is there anything else that you'd like to share with the listeners from your experience as a compounding pharmacy owner and pharmacist? And this can be anything, any last, I hate to say any last words, but any last words of advice on that?
Well, I just feel it's really important that I'd like to encourage other owners just to do this and not wait. I don't feel like it's going to go away. I think it's something that is important to protect your staff. I was a little upset. I don't want to say upset. I was a little taken back that the deadline was pushed back so far, because I don't feel like anybody's really ever going to be ready unless we force this on pharmacies. So I would have rather they kept the date, obviously, since I was ready to go. But my theory is, I want to encourage people to get this done, use the references and resources that are out there. ACHC and Compounding Consultants are who I used, but I know there's other entities. And I feel like you, as an owner, and especially when you're inundated with things that you have to be doing every day.
I think that's really great advice. I, like you, Cheri, was, I think upset, maybe a little overstepping the word, but
Yeah,
disappointed is probably on the tip of my tongue.
yeah,
Disappointed
yeah.
that Friday I got an email from a friend, from a colleague, who gave me about a 1 hour warning. And that was a tough weekend for me, because this is how I make my living. I'm a USP 800 design, facility engineering, workflow guy. And I've delved myself into this because in years past, I was talking about aspects of USP 800 before there was a USP 800. Like you, I've been
Right.
concerned
Like
about
me. Yeah.
personnel,
Yes.
personnel,
Yeah.
personnel protection. That's always been my thing. And so, that deadline being pushed back, I'm like you, it's not going to go away. Matter of fact, if you look at the very last paragraph of that USP press release, whatever they were calling it, it says we still encourage early adoption, which
Right.
tells me, in fact, it is not going to go away. Yes, there needs to be some harmonization, but that's going to be more on that 797 chapter side. 800 to me seems to be solid. It's in place. And now you've got plenty of time to plan for it, but don't drag your feet on it. Exactly what you
Right.
said, Cheri. You
Right.
nailed it.
Yep. Get it done. What you don't know, you don't know. So know it and get it done. You don't know what you don't know. And I keep hearing myself say that. Well, all these tools and training that we've gone through, to become compliant, I've learned a lot. And yes, it's not that I've learned it all at once, but I've learned it, like in my situation, I've been PCAB for now. This is my third reaccreditation, so I keep learning every time I come to the year I need a new reaccreditation. So I just want to encourage everybody just to jump in, get it done, because I think it's important to protect staff. I feel like, and I even brought a speaker in to actually, her name is Christine Russell. I would encourage you guys to call her sometime because she was very good. So I did a 12-hour CE training on a weekend with my staff just on USP 800, and I just am trying to be transparent about it. This is the risk that you're dealing with, but you're more protected here than you're even going to be in a retail setting because all the retail people are dragging their feet about this. So I just feel like transparency and to get it done.
I say that same exact thing that you say, you don't know what you don't know. I say that all the time. And, the one thing that I've kind of come to since doing this and, forming relationships with my pharmacy board inspectors, I'm becoming a little bit more involved on that level. And I've sat in on some of these USP 800 meetings, and, it becomes really apparent that the people that are representing hospitals, that are representing even just like community pharmacies, they simply have not read the standard, period. And
agree.
there's many boards, including my own, who, there's a whole bunch of people saying, no, we have to delay until 2021. 2021? What?
Yeah.
And
yeah.
I'm of the same mindset that like people are not going to they're not going to do anything until you hold their feet to the fire.
I agree.
It's just funny.
Well, and it is expensive. And the space is probably one of the biggest concerns because I'm trying to help a few pharmacies just around the area here and in Sioux Falls in our state, and there's just no room. They don't have any space. So I'm fortunate that I have the space.
Thanks for joining us for the Pharmacy Inspection Podcast. I'd really like to thank everyone for the kind words of support and encouragement we've received. We started this podcast with the intention of honestly just trying to help raise the bar for compounding pharmacy, and it's great to hear that the show is bringing some important topics to light. Next week on the podcast, we're going to be stepping into the world of 503B pharmacy. We have on the show a friend and colleague, Bill Fixler, who co-owns a few pharmacies, and his latest venture is opening a 503B that has been many, many months in the making. I know he's learned a lot from the experience, and he'll be sharing some of that with us. Hope you join us next week for what I know is going to be an awesome discussion. Thanks again, and keep raising the bar.